Diagon Alley. Harry had to blink. It took his eyes a moment to get used to the dim lighting. When they had finally penetrated the twilight, he noticed that something was strange. The light was dimmed and only individual rays of sunlight shone gently through a few round skylights, the decorations of which made them look like Viking shields. The walls were made of medieval half-timbering. Grapevines grew up the bulky wooden pillars, with plum grapes on them, and the owls sitting in the timber completed the feeling that Harry had entered a dark fairy-tale forest instead of a pub. All around were round tables, at which dozens of people of different ages sat, ate and drank, chatting happily, whispering quietly or silently lost in thought. Old ladies drank sherry from small glasses and smoked long pipes. Children laughed and older men argued quietly but excitedly, bent over their newspapers. The air was filled with smoke, like cannon smoke after a battle. The smell, however, was not the biting stench of tobacco, but a pleasantly spicy scent that Harry had never smelled before. A small man in a top hat was talking to the old bartender, who was completely bald and looked a bit like a greasy walnut. Hagrid seemed to be known around here, because many waved to him briefly before returning to their conversations. While Hagrid headed straight through the pub toward the back wall, Harry walked briskly beside him, letting his astonished gaze wander over the crowd. The only article of clothing that almost all guests had in common were hats. Most were wearing the traditional pointy hat that Harry knew from many classic fairy tales. The second most common item was a kind of small cloak. It only covered their shoulders, a small part of their upper back, and leaving the front part open, similar to the upper part of a coachman's coat. Some had a hood attached to it, instead of a collar. These small cloaks were held together by artistic brooches, usually with animal or plant motifs. They also carried shoulder bags, or belts with small leather bags on them, usually hung casually over the backs of chairs. Many wore either sandals or boots, some old and worn out, some new and elegant, either pointy at the front or just sturdy hiking boots. But the reason why Harry was staring at the crowd, with his eyes wide open, was that everyone, except for the before-mentioned items, were completely stark naked. There was a cozy, friendly, almost homely atmosphere, and no one seemed to be ashamed in any way. Harry suddenly remembered vividly how, when he was a very small child, he had once carelessly run out of the house naked to play with some chalk that other children had carelessly left lying around. Aunt Petunia had grabbed him by the hair, screeching at him, and dragged him back into the house, calling him a naughty, thoughtless brat so loudly that it could be heard up and down the street. After that, she locked him under the stairs for 3 days straight. Harry suddenly emerged from his thoughts when Hagrid stopped in front of a big wooden cupboard at the end of the room. He pulled a bulky iron key out of his pocket and put it in the lock. As he turned it, Harry thought he heard a strange rattling and clicking before the lock unlocked and the massive cupboard door swung open. The wardrobe was very spacious and only contained a big shoulder bag matching Hagrid's mole coat.
"You can use mine too,"
Hagrid said happily as he took off his coat and hung it in the cupboard.
"Since you don't have your own yet."
Then he took off his trousers and shirt and threw them carelessly into the wardrobe.
"Come on, what are you waiting for?"
Harry hesitated.
Hagrid?
He began, unsure of how to put it.
Is everyone naked here all the time?
Harry felt his ears and face turn bright red at this question, but Hagrid just squinted in amusement.
Yes, you don't know about that. We're not as stupid as the muggles here. We're not wearing clothes all day. We're not that squeamish."
Harry blinked again in surprise, but didn't know how to respond to this statement.
"Come on, we still have a lot of stuff to get today,"
said Hagrid encouragingly. Harry hesitated again as he grabbed his pants and underpants. No one here would pull his hair for that. No Uncle Vernon, Cousin Dudley, or classmates who would bully him with naked Harry for days. Suddenly Harry felt a surge of rebellion wash over him. As if he wanted to show the Dursleys his bare bottom in person, to see their shocked faces, as satisfaction for their years of abuse and oppression. A rush of adrenaline ran through him and he felt slightly dizzy with excitement. To hell with the Dursleys and all their stupid rules. Harry grabbed his trousers and, like you would pull off a plaster, he pulled them down in one fell swoop. He felt very dizzy. He had just done something the Dursleys had told him never to do, especially not outside of a closed-off space. because, like almost everything he did, it would damage their reputation. Still filled with an intoxicating feeling of liberation, he put the rest of his clothes in the cupboard with Hagrid's things. He was breathing heavily and his face was still a bright red.
Are you okay?
Hagrid asked worriedly.
You're shaking all of a sudden. Already excited, aren't you?
He smiled shakily and nodded at Hagrid. The excitement was still running through him. It felt good somehow to just throw off the old rags that the Dursleys had dressed him in. As they turned left and walked along the bar counter towards a small back door, the bald bartender turned his gaze to the two of them and asked,
The usual Hagrid?
Not today, Tom. I'm on a mission for Hogwarts.
Hagrid said and gave Harry a big slap on the back that almost brought him to his knees.
My goodness.
Said the innkeeper, glancing over at Harry.
Can that?
The Leaky Cauldron suddenly became completely silent.
Isn't it?
Whispered the old bartender.
Harry Potter, what an honor.
He rushed out from behind the bar, walked quickly towards Harry and took his hand, with tears in his eyes.
Welcome home, Mr. Potter, welcome home.
Harry didn't know what to say. Now all eyes were on him. All of a sudden, Harry felt a little embarrassed that he had stared at everyone earlier, especially since he was now the one everyone was staring at. An old woman puffed on her pipe, without noticing that it had gone out. Hagrid had a big smile on his face. Now there was a great stir of chairs in the Leaky Cauldron, and the guests shook Harry's hand one by one.
Doris Crockford, Mr. Potter, I just can't believe I'm finally meeting you.
I'm so proud to meet you, Mr. Potter, so proud.
I've always wanted to shake your hand. I feel so dizzy.
Please, Mr. Potter, I'm lost for words. Diggle is my name. Daedalus Diggle.
I've seen you before.
Harry exclaimed as Daedalus Diggle lost his top hat in excitement.
You bowed to me in a shop once.
He still remembers.
Daedalus Diggle exclaimed and looked around.
Did you hear that? He remembers me.
Harry shook hands here and hands there. Doris Crockford couldn't get enough. It was like one of those dreams where you accidentally come to school naked, only the other way around. Everyone was happy that he was here. A pale young man made his way forward. He looked very nervous and his left eye was twitching. He wore a turban, elegant leather gloves and a shawl, like the ones mothers sometimes wore to carry their babies, and elegantly pointy but very worn-out shoes.
Professor, I didn't notice you there,
said Hagrid.
Harry, Professor Quirrell is one of your teachers at Hogwarts.
Potter,
stuttered Professor Quirrell, taking Harry's hand.
I can't tell you how pleased I am to meet you. What kind of magic do you teach, Professor Quirrell? Defense against the dark arts,
muttered Professor Quirrell, as if he'd rather not think about it.
Not that you would need it, do you, Potter?
He laughed nervously.
You're getting your equipment, I presume. I also need to pick up a new book on vampires.
The very thought of it made him look terribly frightened. There was something amusing about the idea that even the teachers at his new school would be naked. He felt as though it would greatly diminish the unnecessary strictness and unfairness that teachers usually exuded. It was hard for Harry to imagine someone who was wearing only a turban and boots as a viciously strict person. But the others did not allow Professor Quirrell to keep Harry to himself. It took him nearly 10 minutes to get away from everyone. Finally, Hagrid was able to make himself heard over the general excitement.
We got to go. We have a lot of shopping to do. Come on, Harry.
Doris Crockford shook Harry's hand one last time and Hagrid gently pushed him towards the door at the end of the bar. Harry had to blink again as they stepped out, back into daylight. They had stepped into a strange little courtyard. It was as if they had suddenly entered a small chamber of an old stone castle. The walls were made of rough stone bricks and large blocks of stone lay on top of them. Harry was reminded of a miniature version of a medieval city wall. Hagrid grinned at Harry.
I told you, didn't I? Told you were famous. Even Professor Quirrell shivered when he saw you. Well, he shivers almost all the time.
Is he always so nervous?
Ah, yes. Poor guy. Brilliant mind. He was fine when he was just studying the books, but then he took a year off to gain some experience. They say he met vampires in the Black Forest and he had a nasty little problem with a hag. He hasn't been the same since then. He's scared of the students, scared of his own class material.
Vampires? Hags? Harry was a little dizzy again.
Where's my umbrella now?
Meanwhile, Hagrid pulled out his pink umbrella, which he had previously packed into his shoulder bag, along with the other stuff from his coat pockets. He approached the wall and whispered to himself.
3 up, 2 to the side. Okay, 1 step back, Harry.
He called over his shoulder as he counted the stones on the wall and tapped a few of them with the tip of his umbrella. When he touched the 7th stone in the wall, Harry jumped back in shock. With a loud rumbling and scraping noise, the heavy stones of the wall suddenly moved and formed a door frame. When Harry's shock had subsided, his eyes caught sight of what lay behind the small courtyard, on the other side of the stone passage. Something that he would never have expected in the heart of London. It was as if Harry, instead of looking into a hidden side alley, as one would expect to find at the back of the houses and shops of a big city, was looking directly into the ruins of a lost Celtic civilization, which were already half overgrown by a dense jungle.
Welcome to Diagon Alley.
Huge, thick trees clung to the back walls of the Muggle houses. Hanging from their branches, at regular intervals, were lanterns with dancing lights inside them, which, like street lamps, bathed everything in a warm golden light. In between, also hanging from thick, heavy branches, were shop signs whose paintwork sometimes seemed to move slightly. The trees had windows, doors, and displays, and there was a lot of activity everywhere. People scurried back and forth under awnings made of leaves, and between benches made of roots. The ground, between the thick roots, on which people walked back and forth, consisted of thick stone blocks, as did the door and window frames of many buildings. All of this reminded Harry, at the same time, of the stone blocks of Stonehenge and of lost Indian temple ruins, that were overgrown with trees, whose roots had gently pressed themselves between the stones and seemed to hold them together. Small sales carts rattled up and down the street and travelling traders offered their wares. As Harry and Hagrid walked down the street, Harry's gaze wandered upwards. At the height of the roofs were the treetops, which enveloped the entire street in a pleasant darkness. From above, it must have looked as if these houses had large backyards in which tall trees with dense treetops grew. In this way, even people in a passing helicopter or plane would not be able to see anything of the hustle and bustle below them. Only individual rays of light strayed through the thick canopy of leaves, down to the sidewalk, drawing atmospheric patches of light on the scenery. Moss, grasses, and mushrooms grew between the mighty paving slabs, and small trenches had been left between the thick stone blocks, through which rainwater could drain. Hagrid pointed to the various shop windows, as they walked past, and said things like,
There's broom accessories, and here's a lot of stuff you need for potions.
In front of the shop that Hagrid had last pointed to, an older witch with greying hair was standing and yelling,
Unicorn hair for 17 sickles an ounce? They must be crazy!
Harry suddenly felt a sinking feeling in his stomach.
Hagrid?
He asked timidly.
How am I supposed to pay for all of this? I don't have any money.
Hagrid, however, just gave a cheerful laugh and replied,
You don't think your parents left you with nothing, do you?
He pointed straight ahead to a tall building made almost entirely of massive stone blocks, which divided the street in front of them into 2 paths and whose grey, chiseled stone stood out magnificently and imperiously from the green surroundings.
Over there, at Grimnir's Bank. There we can get some money for you. I have to go there anyway, on official business.
Harry looked at the massive, fortress-like building and wondered why it stood out so much from the others. The individual stone blocks were not held together by tree roots, but polished bronze and iron fittings. Mighty statues seemed to support the building by leaning their backs against it. The bearded statues had elaborately and detailed carved armor and held real, larger-than-life hammers, pickaxes or battle axes in their hands. They were unusually broad and stocky and at first reminded Harry of Hagrid. The walls had been carved in such a way that they reminded Harry of Irish gravestones, with their intricate lines. When they arrived in front of the building, they walked up a small carved staircase to a mighty gate that reminded Harry of a castle entrance or a magnificent cathedral gate. The reliefs on them showed bearded men mining, blacksmithing or holding up precious gemstones. The portal was wide open, and to the right and left, on 2 low pedestals, stood 2 small men, looking not unlike the oversized statues. As if they were statues themselves. They had rested their short battle axes on the ground in front of them, their hands resting on the handles. They seemed to be secretly glancing at Harry and Hagrid. Harry was reminded of the guards in front of Buckingham Palace. The men were both no more than 4 feet tall, but their broad stature immediately inspired respect when you looked at them. These were the first actually clothed people Harry had seen in Diagon Alley so far.
Hagrid?
Whispered Harry.
Aren't those wizards?
What?
Said Hagrid defensively.
No, Harry. They're dwarfs, of course. The best miners, treasure hunters, and goldsmiths in the entire world.
And after Hagrid had said this, Harry thought he noticed how the two gatekeepers straightened their backs, almost imperceptibly, and smiled proudly. They entered through the large gate into a huge hall, supported by big stone pillars and ornate Gothic arches. There, several dwarfs were sitting at long counters to the right and left, wearing only different hats, caps, boots and gloves, and they seemed to be doing different things depending on their headgear. They all seemed to be very corpulent, bearded, hairy men. However, their bellies were too low for Harry to be able to see their genitalia. Several dwarfs with leather caps were busy cutting diamonds, while others with berets and feathers were setting them in gold or silver, others with iron helmets were carving statues, and still others were waving and examining various precious materials. Harry was very impressed by so much craftsmanship.
They don't like me very much,
Hagrid admitted.
It's probably because I'm so tall. They don't really trust anyone over 5 feet.
Harry couldn't help but grin slightly at this comment. Halfway across the room, a dwarf suddenly came towards them, who immediately seemed inviting with his rosy cheeks and his friendly smile. He was the only dwarf in the room wearing a kind of green pointy cap. He bowed a little to the two of them and asked kindly,
"Good day, gentlemen. My name is Alfred Olfson. How can I help you?"
We have to see the boss, Master Dane Gulderson. Confidential matter.
Alfred nodded, also with a serious expression, and then gestured both of them to follow him. He led them along the long tables to the end of the hall, where, to Harry's surprise, there grew a large tree that was bathed in sunlight through a round dome-shaped skylight on the ceiling. It grew on a boulder in the middle of a small round pool of water and was surrounded by 7 menhirs, about the size of dwarfs. Water lily leaves were bobbing on the water, and Harry realized it was an apple tree, on whose branches the dwarfs had apparently attached apples made of pure gold to golden wires. The tree towered majestically over a heavy oak desk, which in turn stood on a small pedestal, and at which a dwarf with a grey beard and hair sat, on an ornate wooden throne, a pair of half-round reading glasses on his big round nose and engrossed in stacks of documents. On his head sat a golden circlet, with the same Celtic decorations that adorned the walls of the building. As they approached, Hagrid cleared his throat and the dwarf looked up. Harry saw that his gaze was stern but calm, resting on Hagrid.
Mr. Potter would like to withdraw money from his vault,
Hagrid explained, again with a serious expression. Then he leaned forward a little and whispered,
Also, I have this for you.
And handed the dwarf an envelope.
It's about the you-know-what, and vault number you-know-which.
Gulderson frowned and examined the heavy wax seal, with the emblem of Hogwarts on it, that sealed the letter Hagrid had just given him. He took an ornate letter opener from a drawer and gently opened the letter. After roughly scanning its contents, he nodded almost conspiratorially to Hagrid, and gestured for Elfrid to approach him. He whispered something in his ear, in a language that Harry didn't understand, and discreetly handed Elfrid something. Elfrid closed his hand around it, nodded to his superior and indicated Harry and Hagrid to follow him.